Every man who insults you in public does not always want to make you small. Sometimes what he really wants is to make the whole world look at him. That morning, there was a man like that standing on my stage, 70 years old. A foreign diplomat the world knew as intelligent, sophisticated, and successful. A man whose name opened doors in 11 countries before he ever said a word. I did not find out his real reason for coming until it was far too late to stop it. He had not come on my show to win a game. He had come for the cameras, for the clip, for the kind of controversy that turns into free advertising for a billion-dollar company that bears his family name. His plan, I would later understand, was simple and almost elegant in its cruelty. Insult Steve Harvey on live television. Let the outrage build for 48 hours. Let every major network repeat his name in the same breath as mine, and walk away with his company trending in 100 countries by Friday. I want to tell you exactly what he said. I want to tell you what happened in the 4 minutes after he said it, because I did not do what he expected me to do, and neither did anyone else in that building. And I want to tell you what arrived at my office a month later in an envelope that had been mailed by a man who, by the time it reached my hands, was no longer alive to know whether I had forgiven him. If you love America and believe in peace, unity, and respect, comment "We love America." Subscribe right now and turn on the bell, because what this audience did that day is something I have never been able to fully explain, and I've been trying to explain it for a year. This is the story. I have done this show for a long time. I have learned that the loudest insult in a room is rarely the one that costs a man the most. It is usually the quiet one, the one he has rehearsed in private for years before he ever says it out loud in front of strangers. I did not know, walking out onto that stage that morning, that I was about to watch a man say his quiet one out loud on live television in front of 200 people who had only come to laugh. It was supposed to be a celebrity charity special. Once a year, we invite a handful of public figures onto the show for a lighter episode. Less competition, more conversation, a little comedy, a check written to a children's hospital at the end. My producers had been trying to book Ambassador Henrik Voss for 2 seasons. He represented his country's trade delegation and sat at the head of Voss Industries, a conglomerate his grandfather had built out of a single shipping port. Sophisticated man, 3 languages, a reputation in the business press for charm that could close any room. What none of us knew, what even my longtime producer Denise did not catch in 3 rounds of pre-interviews, was that Ambassador Voss had spent the past 18 months watching his company's stock slide quietly downward as younger, louder competitors ate into his shipping contracts. A board meeting 2 weeks before that taping had not gone well for him. A reporter close to his office later told my staff that Voss had said in a private dinner that what his brand needed was not another press release. It needed a moment, something the algorithms could not ignore. He picked my show because my show is loud, my show is live, and my show reaches the exact demographic his dying contracts needed to notice him again. A man losing market share does not need a better product. Sometimes he just needs the world to be talking about his name again, for any reason at all, before the quarterly numbers come out. Denise had pulled his company's stock chart up on her tablet 2 days before the taping, more out of curiosity than concern. She showed it to me in passing. A long, slow, downward slope, the kind that does not panic anyone in a single afternoon, but quietly worries a board of directors over 18 months. I remember telling her it was none of our business. I still believe that. It simply turned out to be relevant in a way neither of us could have predicted. I did not know any of that backstage. Backstage, he was charming. He shook my hand with both of his. He told my staff in front of me that he had watched the show with his late wife for years before she passed, and that doing this episode was a small tribute to her taste in American television. I believed him. I had no reason not to. I want you to sit with that for a second because it matters for what comes later. The man who was about to humiliate 200 people's faith in him backstage was warm enough that even I, 61 years old, 40 years in this business, did not see it coming. His personal interpreter, a quiet man named Felix who had worked for the ambassador for 9 years, stood off to the side during introductions, headset around his neck, notebook in hand. He barely spoke during the pre-show walkthrough, the way people do when they have spent a career being present without ever being the point of the room. I shook his hand too, the way I shake every hand backstage, and thought nothing more of it. Felix would matter more than anyone expected him to before the segment was over. We went live at 11 that morning. The first few minutes were exactly what charity specials are supposed to be. Easy banner. A few questions about his company's recent solar shipping initiative. The audience laughed at my opening joke about diplomats never actually answering a direct question. The kind of joke that gets a warm laugh, not a mean one. Ambassador Voss laughed along with it, or pretended to. Then we moved into the game segment, a lighthearted trivia round I run with celebrity guests. Nothing that should have mattered to a man with 3 economics degrees. He got the first question wrong. The audience groaned good-naturedly, the way audiences do. I teased him gently, the way I tease every guest who misses an easy one. I said, Ambassador, that's the kind of mistake that gets you recalled. The audience laughed. He smiled. But something in his eyes had already changed. And I understand now that the smile was the last polite thing he planned to do on my stage. He leaned toward his microphone, still smiling, and said, perhaps the questions are simply not written for educated people. You are, after all, just a third-class comedian. 200 people went quiet in that particular way. Audiences go quiet when they are deciding whether they heard what they think they heard. I did not flinch. I have heard worse from better men. I smiled back at him and said, educated men usually know better than to insult the man holding the microphone, Ambassador. But go on. That should have been the end of it. A sharp exchange, a bit of tension, the kind of moment that makes good television and gets forgotten by lunch. It was not the end of it. He missed the second question too, and this time the audience's laugh was smaller, more uncertain. They could feel something shifting in him that they could not yet name. He turned toward me, still smiling that same practiced smile, and said, perhaps the survey was written by the same people who write your jokes. Neither seems to require much education. I let that one go with a shrug and a line about diplomats always needing the last word, and the audience laughed again, a little relieved. I thought we had found our footing back into the lighter show this was supposed to be. He kept going, his voice rising slightly, his accent thickening the way accents do when a man stops choosing his words carefully and starts saying whatever sits closest to the surface. He said something about my comedy being beneath the level of serious conversation. Then, with the same smile still fixed on his face, he said something else. Something about people who look like me, about an entire race of people, not just me, phrased in the clipped, clinical language of a man who has said such things at private dinners his whole life and has simply never said them with 200 cameras and a live broadcast running. I am not going to repeat his exact words in this video. Some sentences do not deserve to be repeated. I will tell you only that it was the kind of sentence that reaches back through centuries. Dressed up that morning in a tailor's suit and a diplomat's vocabulary, but as old and as ugly as anything ever spoken to, keep a man in his place. The studio went silent in a way I have only felt a handful of times in 40 years on a stage. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind where you can hear the air conditioning in the rig overhead and somebody's chair creak 3 rows back. I looked at him. In the space of maybe 2 seconds, though it felt much longer standing in it, 3 things moved through me. The first was an old reflex. The one 40 years of comedy hands you for free. I had a line ready. I always have a line ready. The kind that would have folded him in half in front of 200 people and a national audience, and the clip would have run for a week. The second was a simple, cold piece of arithmetic. If I used that line, the story tomorrow would not be about what he said. It would be about how I reacted to it. He would have gotten exactly the headline he came for, just with different words attached to it. The third was my audience itself. 200 faces I could feel without even turning to look at them. Every one of them waiting to see what kind of man was going to answer for them in that room. I did not raise my voice. I did not point a finger. I did not say a single word. I smiled because in that exact second, I understood his entire plan. I understood why a 70-year-old man with 3 economics degrees had walked onto a comedy show and thrown away his dignity over a trivia question. He was not trying to beat me. He was trying to make me lose my composure on live television because a clip of Steve Harvey losing his temper at a foreign dignitary would have traveled around the world by dinner time, and his name and his company's name would have traveled with it. If I had given him my anger, he would have won. I thought in that second of a man named Wendell Price, who ran the comedy club where I worked the door and swept the floors for 2 years before anyone ever let me near a microphone. Wendell used to tell every young comedian who came through that room the same thing. The man who makes you mad has already written your next 10 minutes for you. Don't ever let another man write your material. I had not thought about Wendell in years. I thought about him standing 6 feet from Ambassador Henrik Voss with 200 people watching to see what I would do next. So I gave him my silence instead. If you have ever watched someone try to provoke you into becoming the villain of your own story, drop the word silence in the comments right now. I read these. I'm going to come back to this exact comment section in a future video because what you write here matters to me more than you know. Now keep watching because what happened in the next 4 minutes was not something I planned. It was something this audience built without my permission. I did not get the chance to respond because I never needed to. A woman in the third row stood up first. Her name, I would learn afterward, was Eleanor Maddox, 81 years old, a retired school teacher who had taught English literature in the same Atlanta public school system for 36 years. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands when their knees have earned the right to take their time, and she did not wait to be called on, and she did not raise her hand. She said, in a voice that did not shake even once, "Sir, I taught children to read for 36 years. Children this country gave up on before they finished the 3rd grade, and every single one of them had more class in their little finger than you have shown this entire morning." The audience did not laugh. They did not need to. Several people began to applaud, quietly at first, then less quietly. Before the ambassador could open his mouth to answer her, a man 2 sections over stood up. Hank Dussault, a veteran, 74 years old, a baseball cap with a faded unit insignia still on his head from whatever errand he run that morning before the taping. White man, broad shoulders gone soft with age, voice like gravel. He had come to the taping that morning as a guest of his niece, who worked for the network and had told her over breakfast that he was only coming along to keep her company. Nobody, least of all him, expected him to be the one standing up in front of 200 strangers an hour later. He said, "I spent 2 tours overseas defending the right of men like you to come to this country and open your mouth. I'm asking you, man to man, to think very hard about whether what just came out of it was worth the trip." The room was no longer quiet. It was charged, the way a room gets charged right before a storm breaks, except the storm breaking was not anger. It was something closer to a verdict. A younger man near the back, a college student who had won 2 tickets to a campus raffle, I learned later, stood up next, his voice unsteady but carrying. He said, "My grandmother sat in the back of a bus so I could sit anywhere I wanted in this room today. You don't get to stand on this stage and act like none of that happened." Nobody laughed. Nobody clapped right away either. They just listened, the way a courtroom listens to a closing statement. And then something happened that I've never seen before in 40 years of live television, and I do not expect to see it again. Felix, the ambassador's own interpreter, the quiet man with the headset and the notebook, the man who had translated the ambassador's words faithfully for 9 years across a dozen countries, set down his headset on the stand in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He looked directly at the control booth and he said, clearly enough for the live microphone to catch every word, "I will not translate what he just said for the international feed." I have a daughter. I will not put those words in my own mouth for her to hear one day. And then he walked off the stage. I want you to understand what that meant. Felix had worked for this man for 9 years. Felix's career, his visa status, his family stability, all of it ran through his loyalty to Ambassador Voss. And in front of 200 people and a live national broadcast, Felix chose his daughter over his paycheck. The ambassador opened his mouth to say something, to whom I am still not sure, because by then the entire studio had turned against him in a way no amount of charm or money was going to talk back from. Not a riot, not chaos. Something quieter and far more devastating. 200 ordinary people simply refusing all at once to give him the reaction he had built his entire morning around. I never said another word about it on camera. I did not need to. I stood at center stage and let it happen. Because the truest answer to a man trying to use you is to let the people who actually know your worth speak it back to him. Unscripted, unpaid, and unprompted. We cut to a commercial break 4 minutes after his remark. When we came back, Ambassador Voss was no longer in his chair. A staff member later told me he asked to be escorted to his car early before the segment officially ended. We finished the show with an empty seat where $1 billion company's name had been sitting 20 minutes earlier. I told the studio audience before we wrapped, we are not going to spend the rest of this morning talking about a man who is no longer in the room. We're going to talk about the children's hospital this show was built to support today because that is the only headline that should come out of this building. Denise scrambled the back half of the show on the fly, pulled up the donation numbers early, brought out 2 children from the hospital's pediatric ward who had been scheduled for a later segment, let Eleanor Maddox, still standing near her seat, say a few words about the importance of a good education to a packed room that had not stopped buzzing. We raised more money in the second half of that taping than we had in the 3 years prior, combined. I do not think that was a coincidence. I think a room full of people who have just watched dignity win out over cruelty is a room that wants very badly to do something good with its hands. When the ambassador walked out of the building that afternoon, the press was already waiting for him. Exactly the kind of press attention his plan had been built to attract. But the headlines were not the ones he had paid a publicist to imagine. By that evening, 2 financial news outlets were already asking questions about the comments. By the next morning, a logistics partner his company had worked with for 11 years issued a brief statement reevaluating the relationship in light of recent remarks. By the end of that week, 3 more partners had done the same, each statement a little more careful, a little more distant than the last. A shipping contract his grandfather had personally signed 40 years earlier was quietly allowed to lapse without renewal. The free publicity he had gambled his entire reputation on had arrived right on schedule. It had simply arrived wearing the wrong face. If you have ever watched karma take his time and then arrive all at once, share this video with someone right now who needs to hear that the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually, even when it takes the long way around. Just one share. Then keep watching, because what happened that same night is the part of this story I still have the hardest time talking about. That same night, driving back from a private dinner meant to manage the damage, Ambassador Voss's car was struck on a wet interstate by a truck that lost control changing lanes. It was raining hard enough that night that 2 other accidents were reported on the same stretch of highway within the hour. An ordinary, miserable night that became, for one family, the night everything changed. He survived. I want to be clear about that because I do not take any peace in what happened to him physically. He survived, but the left side of his body never recovered. Doctors told his family he would not walk unassisted again. I learned all of this the way most of the country learned it, through the news, days later, in a tone reporters use when a story has stopped being entertainment and started being something heavier. I remember exactly where I was standing in my kitchen when I read it, and I remember setting my phone down on the counter and not picking it back up for almost 20 minutes. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because I think it is the most important part of this entire story. I felt sick. I've stood on enough stages in enough difficult rooms to know the difference between a man getting what he deserves and a man simply running out of road. What happened to him was not justice I had asked for. It was not anything I had asked for. It was just what was left after a man spent 70 years building a life on the wrong foundation, and that foundation finally gave out from under him in a single wet, ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday night. I have never once, before or since, wished physical harm on a man for the things he said to me. I do not wish it on him now, even with the letter sitting in my drawer. I only know that the world does not always wait for us to ask permission before it hands us the consequences of our own choices. A month passed. The story moved on the way these stories always do, replaced by newer outrage, newer clips, newer names. I did not think about Ambassador Henrik Voss every day, but I thought about him more than I expected to. Then, on an otherwise unremarkable Thursday afternoon, an envelope arrived at my production office. Handwritten. The handwriting uneven, slanted, the kind of penmanship that comes from a hand that no longer fully obeys the man attached to it. It was from him. I am not going to read you every line of that letter. Some of it was private, written for me and no one else, and I intend to keep it that way. But I will tell you what it said, because I think you need to hear it as much as I did. He wrote that he had spent 3 weeks in a hospital bed with nothing to do but listen to the part of his own mind he had spent 70 years too busy to hear. He wrote that he had built 3 companies, sat across from 4 presidents, and never once, in 70 years, sat still long enough to ask himself why the thought he said out loud on my stage had been sitting in him at all, waiting for the right humiliation to let it out. He wrote about his grandfather, the man who built the shipping company from a single port, and how certain things had been said around that family's dinner table for 3 generations that nobody in the family had ever thought to question, because questioning them had never once cost any of them anything, until it cost him everything in a single morning. He wrote that his wife, the one he claimed to have watched my show with for years before she passed, would not have recognized the man who said those words, and that this, more than the stroke, more than the paralysis, was the injury he was still trying to survive. And then he wrote the sentence I have read more times than I can count since that envelope arrived. He wrote, "Steve, I came to your stage to use you. I did not come to defeat you. Defeat was never the point, only the appearance of it. But that morning, in front of your audience, I learned that the only real weakness in that building was never you. It was the 70 years of my own thinking I had never once questioned. I do not expect you to forgive me. I only wanted you to know that I finally see it. I held that letter for a long time before I noticed something printed in small type on the return envelope, the name and crest of a hospital, not his office. I remember reading it twice, certain I had misread it the first time, the way your eyes do when they are looking for a reason not to believe what is right in front of them. I called the number on the letterhead the next morning to ask whether there was an address I could write back to. The woman who answered was quiet for a moment longer than felt normal. Then she told me, gently, that Ambassador Voss had passed away 2 days earlier. Complications, she said, from the original injuries. He had asked in his final week that the letter still be mailed, even though by his own admission to the nurse who helped him write it, he did not expect to be alive to read whatever I might have written back. I sat in my dressing room with that letter in my hands for almost an hour. Nobody on my staff said anything to me. I think they could tell from my face that whatever was in that envelope was not something words were going to fix that morning. Denise came by once, looked at me through the half-open door, and simply closed it again without a word. I have worked with her for 14 years. She knows the difference between a man who wants company and a man who needs to sit alone with something for a while. When we taped the next episode, I told the studio audience the truth, plainly, the way I am telling you now. I told them a man had written me a letter, and that by the time it reached me, he was no longer alive to know what I would have written back. And I told them this: hatred has never once, in the history of this world, made anybody a winner. Sometimes the bill for our words comes due immediately, in a silent studio. Sometimes it comes due a month later, in a hospital bed, in handwriting that does not look like the man's anymore. But it always comes due, So do not spend your life learning how to defeat people. Spend it learning how to win their hearts instead, because none of us are promised enough time to begin our last letter with the word sorry. I have thought many times since about how easy it would have been to take the other road that morning. I had the wit, I had the platform, I had a room full of people who would have cheered if I had torn them apart in front of them. And for a long time after, I think I would have told myself I had simply given him what he deserved. But I have learned slowly across a long career that the loudest victories are almost never the ones that last. The quiet ones, the ones nobody claps for in the moment, are usually the only ones that are still standing a year later, still meaning something, still teaching somebody something they needed to learn. I still think about the question underneath this whole story, and I do not believe Ambassador Voss ever actually asked it of me. I believe he asked it of every single person who has ever watched what happened on that stage. If you had been standing where I stood that morning, would you have reached for revenge? Or would you have done what an 81-year-old teacher, a 74-year-old veteran, a college student who never expected to say a word that day, and one tired interpreter did without anyone telling them to, and simply let humanity answer for you? I think about Eleanor Maddox sometimes, sitting in a classroom for 36 years, never once imagining that the most important lesson she would ever teach would be delivered standing up in a television studio at 81 years old to a room full of strangers in under 30 seconds. I think about Felix, who I am told found work with a different delegation within the year and who sent my office a short note thanking us for never once asking him to explain himself for what he did that morning. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for one moment to prove who they really are. Most of them never get the moment. These two got it on live television, and they did not waste it. If this story reminded you that dignity is not something you perform when the cameras are rolling, but something you practice quietly on every ordinary day nobody is watching, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on the bell. We tell the stories that never make it to the headlines the way they should. Real rooms, real silences, real choices. The next one might be the story somebody you love needs to hear today. Take care of each other out there. I will see you in the next one.